Hello, today we're going to be talking about the history of Central America, looking at indigenous populations, European settlement, and the results of that as well. Before we go into our next lecture, that'll be a little bit different. So let's start talking about Central America in terms of the different civilizations that existed before the Europeans arrived. And that includes, of course, there's many different groups. The Chichimec in the northern parts of Mexico are more semi-nomadic groups of people. The Aztec came from that region, and they came down. And when the Europeans came, that they were the dominant society here in Central America. The Maya, of course, have a long history. So we'll be talking about these groups, especially the Aztec and the Maya, but some predecessors before them as well. So one of the first groups, I mean, it's not the first group, but one of the ones that's most notable is the Olmecs. And this is from 1400 BC to 400 BC. I mean, thousands of years of civilization. They were known for these huge head, as you can see on the far right, statues of faces. And they were down there and they influenced a lot of the later civilizations. The Mayan and the Aztec and other groups learned from them and they adopted a lot of their things. And you can see that they were located down here on the Gulf of Mexico. They did things like the ball game. There's a famous ball game that they have with rubber balls and a play court, and you used your hip to hit the ball through the hoops and things like that. And that was one thing that they introduced. Things about ritual sacrifice as well came from the Olmecs, which continued with other groups. They also created a writing style. So they actually had a writing system, and that's independent of what we saw in Eurasia. They also came up with the concept of zero in terms of mathematics. Now, that this is independent of what happened in Europe, especially like in India is where the first concept of zero came in, but Europeans didn't have a concept of zero. So this really influenced mathematics. They also had several different calendars, both yearly, but also through hundreds of years about the calendars about. And they also created city-state kingdoms. So you had different little cities that were their own kingdoms, and they influenced each other and interacted with each other. This influenced, of course, the Mayan and the Aztec later on. Another place, and I had to throw a picture of me in Teotihuacan. This is north of Mexico City, and this is a civilization that existed from 200 BC to 600 AD, and had over 200,000 people. Just a really amazing civilization. They eventually burned everything down and left. And when the Aztec came down from the north, they came through this place and they said, this is basically the city of the gods. And so you can see me right here outside of the Temple of the Sun. If we went the other direction, it'd be the Temple of the Moon. And it's just a really amazing civilization with pyramids. Now the Maya existed, I mean, they still exist, to be honest, but from 250 AD to 900 AD was the height of their civilization. And they were focused on the Yucatan lowlands, but also in the Guatemalan highlands, going into Honduras and other places. Now, in terms of the collapse of the Maya, there's a lot of debate about this, about how it happened. There's issues of climate change. So things became drier. There was a prolonged drought around that time period, 900 AD. Second was political conflict between the city-states. And the idea is that most civilizations can handle a few catastrophes, but if you put them all together at the same time, that leads to the collapse of societies. So what happened to the Maya was basically a combination of different things, climate and political, etc. And so they ended up then abandoning the city states and just becoming small farming communities, which still exist today. So again, the Maya today, especially in the highlands of Guatemala, parts of the Yucatan and Mexico, and they have become just basically small farmers with small villages, and the Maya still exist. Now, the Aztecs were basically the dominant society when the Europeans came. And the most stories say that they came from the north and they made their way down into the modern day, what we call Mexico City. And they first were mercenaries. They were hired to, help other different kingdoms fight other people. And eventually they settled on an island in the middle of the lake Texcoco, from where they expanded. So Tenochtitlan, that is basically where Mexico City is today. It's on Lake Texcoco, and they basically, the only place they could find was in island areas, and they created their own islands and they created their own civilization. And then over time, they went and conquered the different groups that were around them. And it was an amazing city, 250,000 people. It was bigger than Madrid in Spain at that time. They had running water, they had all kinds of things. Another interesting thing from the Aztecs is they had agricultural things because they were living on an island. So they created floating gardens called chinampas, and they still exist to this day. And that's where they basically made mats, as you can see down here in the bottom of this diagram. And then they would plant in trees that would anchor it into the water, and then start growing things and taking things off of the water's bottom to put in as soil. And they were able to actually grow and create crops on this island. And the great thing about this was that you could, because the water moderates temperature, you could grow things year round. And over time, they were able to do this. And if we look at the next one, the black area here in the middle, that's the actual city. All of these side stripe things that you can see here, the crosshatch, those were chinampas, where they were growing crops on the water. And while much of this, the lake is gone now, it's been drained and it's now a huge city, but the chinampas still exist in certain areas. I was able to visit those in the past. And here's an example of the chinampas. You can see the canals with these things, and eventually those floating platforms became actually solid land, and they still grow crops, and you can go visit the chinampas even today. Now, in Central America, if we go past Mexico and go down to the south, we have an interaction between different groups of people. So the people from places like southern Mexico and Guatemala and those, they were based on seed crops. So things like corn. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in more detail. But from the south, you had groups that came up through the isthmus, and they brought tubers, things like potatoes, manioc, yucca, different types of tuber ones. And so there's kind of a dividing line right here in Central America between these two cultural groups. I did my dissertation work, if you look down here on the bottom right, and it says Lenca. That's the group that I worked with in Honduras for several summers. And they're right on the dividing line between corn and tubers. And so that's kind of a cultural line that you can see here between South American peoples and people from Mesoamerica. Of course, then eventually the Europeans came across. We talked about Christopher Columbus before. And by 1513, Balboa made his way down through the Isthmus of Panama and was the first person to see the Pacific. Cortez came across from Cuba and he conquered the Aztec. And he didn't just do the Aztec, he also conquered Honduras and other areas in that region of Mesoamerica. And then Coronado came, and not long afterwards went and traveled up looking for the great golden cities, El Dorado, right? The golden cities. Went up through the Southwest. He made his way all the way in that time period, all the way to Kansas. Now I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my high school is actually called El Dorado after the Coronado expedition. And and the mall that we used to go to as kids to hang out was actually Coronado Mall. all named after him when he came up there in the 1540s. And New Mexico is an interesting place in that it was settled, permanent settlements in 1598. That's before Jamestown, before Plymouth Rock, all of those, they settled in New Mexico. The Spanish did back in those time periods. Now, of course, the interaction between the Europeans and the indigenous populations turned out to be kind of one of the great genocides of history. Almost 90 to 95% of all indigenous populations died within 100 years of contact with the Europeans. And that was due to, of course, disease. We talk about that, where they were not, immune to the different diseases that were brought by the Europeans, but it was also enslavement. It was also putting them to work on plantations and the destruction of their agricultural production. So here's just some estimated numbers for central Mexico. When the Europeans came, there was approximately maybe 25 million people. The numbers we don't know exactly, but about 25 million. By 1595, within 100 years, it was down to 1 million. You see the same thing with Chiapas, that's southern Mexico. Same thing with Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, etc. You guys can see the numbers. It was basically a decimation of the population of indigenous people in the Americas. Now, the colonial economy, of course, these were European countries. It wasn't just the Spanish, it also included the French and English and Dutch and others. But early on, it was the Spanish. And at that time, this was pre-capitalism. It wasn't quite a capitalist society. It was called mercantilism, slightly different. And basically, the idea was to accumulate as much bullion, and bullion is just wealth, whether it's gold, silver, money, whatever it is. And the colonies at that time period existed to enrich the crown. And by the crown, I'm talking about the mother country, whether it's Spain, England, etc. And that was the purpose. And if you look down here in the bottom left, this map, this shows the galleons, the Spanish galleons that would leave from Seville, Spain. And there was two that came every year to the Caribbean and the Americas. One came in May, and it went on a more northerly route. And so it went up and it went to Veracruz in Mexico, where it picked up all the silver and things that they mined from the mountains of Mexico. And then they went and hung out in Havana in Cuba. Another galleon would leave a little bit later, a few months later, and it went a southern route, and it went down to Panama, where ships coming up from Peru would bring the silver and gold that was coming up, and they'd take them on mule trains across the isthmus and load them onto the ships. And then they would go and meet up in Havana, and then they would take their way back over. So on the way in, they would bring in, manufactured goods and cattle and whatever it is. And on the way out, they took out all the riches. On the bottom right, you'll see this kind of picture that I took when I was a study abroad student, and I did study abroad in Puerto Rico, which technically isn't study abroad since it's part of the US, but it's a very different culture. And all the streets in the old part of San Juan are paved in these blue cobblestones, and these are ballast weights. So when a ship is coming across, it's meant to hold cargo. And so to make it, sail correctly, they put ballast weights to hold it down in the water. And when they got to San Juan, Puerto Rico, or Havana, or Santo Domingo, they would then unload the ballast weights and replace them with gold and silver bars. And so when I was in San Juan, they said all these blue cobblestones really indicate the fact that our streets should be paved with gold. We got the blue cobblestones, the gold and the silver went away. So just a little example of the extraction that happened during the mercantilism of taking the riches from the New World to the Old World. Another thing is that during this time period, the colonial economy, they restricted manufacturing. So you weren't allowed to make a nail or a shirt or anything or a chair. Everything had to come back from Spain. And that was meant to protect the industry in Spain. And later that same thing happened in England and France and and the Netherlands. where they didn't allow you to actually produce anything. You just were there for extraction of resources. And so everything had to come back. And arguments is that created underdeveloped economies. We could talk about that more in the future, but in North America, we were allowed to do a lot more when the Europeans came because we didn't have a lot of things to extract, whereas in Central America and Latin America, they did have a lot to extract. And so it created underdeveloped economies, meaning that it was just about extraction, but nothing about production. And that's what leads to actually capitalism, is producing things as opposed to extracting it. So mercantilism was extraction. Capitalism came afterwards, which is much more about production of goods. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about historical stuff as we're coming along and look at population, migration, and urbanization. Central America or Middle America has really high population densities, not in the desert north, much lower. But when you come down here in the highlands, it's a very temperate climate. It's very conducive to agriculture and higher populations. And so we see high population densities in places like southern Mexico, around Mexico City, places like El Salvador and Guatemala, and the other areas. So we have actually pretty high populations, and that's driven migration as well as urbanization. So I really like this graph. This shows kind of that demographic impact of European colonization. In 1492, when Columbus came across and sailed the ocean blue, there was approximately 700 million people in the Americas. By 1800, it was only 20 million. And that's that decimation of that demographic impact of disease and warfare and slavery, etc. By 1900, it got back to 60 million. So it was almost 400 years before, when the Europeans came, that the population got back to the same number. And then we've seen it explode from that point on. 1950, 160 million, 2011, 585 million, and by 2030, we're looking at 710 million people. So we saw that huge demographic impact of European colonization and the impacts of that. And then we've seen a huge increase from that point on. Now, crude birth rates, when we look at Middle America, the highest ones are in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. The other ones are actually really lowering down, whether it's Mexico, Costa Rica, or Panama. But we do see a high, elevated ones in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Crude death rate is pretty low. And that's because you have a high percentage of the population that are young, under the age of 15. And as we mentioned before, that means that like places like in Western Europe, you have a lot more older people, so you have a higher death rate. Whereas when you have a lot of younger people, like in the places that we see in Middle America, we actually see a lower death rate. And in terms of natural increase rate, we see places like Guatemala and Honduras having the highest natural increase rate. If it's over 2%, that's considered high. You see that in sub-Saharan Africa, and then in a few countries here, like I said, Guatemala and Honduras. 2% and above is high growth. If it's 1 to 2%, it's moderate growth. So we see places like Mexico and Panama and Costa Rica. And if it's down to 0 to 1%, like we see in the US, that's considered low growth. And then below 0, like you see here in Europe, that's negative growth. Same thing with Japan, where they're not having enough people. They're not replacing their population. So Central America, we do see elevated rates. Here's some numbers. Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize, they're above 2%. Those are high growth. But then if you move to the Nicaragua, Mexico, Panama, El Salvador, Costa Rica, you can see it's between 0 and 2%, and that's moderate growth. Population densities are also important. Guatemala has a high population density, whereas El Salvador has even higher population density, number of people per square kilometer. So let's look at some population pyramids. And I know we talked about this before. Males on the left, females are on the right, and it's by age cohorts, 0 to 5, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. And if it looks like a pyramid, it means it's a very fast growing population. And Guatemala is kind of the fastest growing one, but you can see just in the last 20, 30 years, it's starting to even out. That means that their fertility rates are going down. They're not having as many children. And so eventually, probably in the next 20, 30 years, they'll go to zero population growth. But at the moment, they are still growing, but it's changing. Here's Mexico. They made that change a little bit earlier, and you can see it indented. So there's less younger people than there are up here. So these are the populations, the 15 to 40-year-olds that are having children, and they're not having as many. They're below replacement level. They have dropped below 2.1, which is replacement level for a population that replaces your mother and father. So they're actually dropping below, and that's a recent change, and it's pretty dramatic. And here's Costa Rica. They did this a long time ago. They were growing fast, but about 40 years ago, we saw a shift, and now it's flatlining. So the kids that are born in the bottom levels are the ones that are from the parents that are at the higher levels, and they're having fewer children. And so they're getting into zero replacement level and going into negative growth soon. Now, population growth also stems things like migration, and this map looks a little bit crazy. I'm not going to make you memorize it. But the green arrows, this is within the region. So if we see this one here, the green one from Guatemala into Mexico, we see migration of people from Guatemala into Mexico for work. And that's kind of the main driver of migration. Yes, we have forced migration, things like earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes, but the number one reason is economics. And so Mexico is better off than Guatemala. So you see people moving from Guatemala into Mexico. Big one is from Nicaragua into Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the most prosperous, along with Panama, in Central America. And so you see a lot of people coming from Nicaragua going into Costa Rica to work. I had some Costa Rican students, and they said that, yeah, almost 20% of their population's from Nicaragua. They're moving there for work. Now, the purple ones, this is within the country. So we see in Mexico, coming from southern Mexico, which is the poorer regions, moving toward the border, where you have a lot of factories, the maquiladoras. And so we see a lot of migration toward the border. And then the red is people moving into abroad, especially coming to the US. So we see a lot of migration, of course, from Mexico, although that's slowing down. The migration from Mexico into the US is actually basically zero now. The amount of people that are coming in and leaving from Mexico is even. And I think there's actually more people leaving, going back to Mexico for multiple reasons that we can talk about. But we see a lot of people coming from Central America. They're fleeing violence, environmental destruction, all kinds of things, the drug trade. So we're seeing a lot more people today coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, a little bit from Nicaragua, coming to the US. All right, we're going to stop right now, and we'll start another video soon. And I hope that was kind of a quick coverage. And like I said, I want to break it up into smaller recordings. So we'll see you in the next video.